Welcome to the PDIA in Action event series. My name is Salimah Samji, and I am the Director of Building State Capability at the Harvard Center for International Development. I will be your moderator today. The format of the session is as follows. I will begin with an overview of the event series, followed by a presentation before we open up for a Q&A session. Feel free to put your questions in the chat during the presentation. Matt Andrews and I co-teach a class at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a field lab class where students learn how to use the PDIA approach, problem-driven iterative adaptation approach, by working on real-world problems. They learn by doing. The students work together in teams with an authorizer or client who gives them a problem to work on. This year, we asked the alumni of our Implementing Public Policy Executive Program to nominate problems for our students to work on. Over a 7-week period between January and March, our students worked with their authorizer to better understand the problem and to identify entry points. The event series showcases the learning of our students as well as our program alumni. Our topic for today's session is abandoned infrastructure projects in Nigeria. And with us, we have our student team, Nathalie Gazzaneo, Tendai Mvuvu, Rodrigo Tejada, Matt Weber. Welcome. The students worked with David Jafaru Wuyep, who is the Chief Technical Advisor and heads Project Management and Results Delivery Office in the Office of the Governor of the Plateau State in Nigeria, and he is also an alumni of our Implementing Public Policy program. I'd now like to invite Rodrigo to get us started. Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you, Salimah. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, can you see that all right? And thank you everyone for joining us in this presentation. Our team is composed by 2 Mastering Public Policy students, Nathalie and myself, and 2 Mastering Public Administration students, Matthew and Tendai. We were tasked with deconstructing and analyzing the problem of abandoned infrastructure projects in Nigeria, specifically in the Plateau State. For this, we worked with our authorizer, which Salimah mentioned is David Wuyep, who is the head of projects management and results delivery office in the state of Plateau. In this presentation, we will first go over our problem construction, or how we came to understand the narrative around the issue. Then we will proceed to our problem deconstruction, or how we identified the elements of the problem and its entry points. We will then talk about the recommendations we devised early in the process and how we eventually consolidated those into an action learning agenda for the state of Plateau and for our authorizer specifically. We will end the presentation with the lessons we learned about the problem of abandoned projects in Nigeria and from the PDIA method in general. So one of the first things we did as a team early on was to construct our understanding and narrative of the problem. Here we realized that the issue of abandoned projects in Nigeria is not only a problem, but a condition rooted in different problems. This condition mainly affects the water, energy, and transportation sectors and is present at all government levels. The problem is very significant at the macroeconomic level because it is estimated that around 12,000 federal government projects have been abandoned in the last 15 years in Nigeria, which amounts to around $29 billion or 10% of the country's GDP. We identified that this condition is rooted in 4 main problems. First, a difficulty in continuing projects after government transitions because of lack of incentives to give continuity to those projects. Second, inadequate project planning. Third, poor budgeting consideration. And fourth, a lack of accountability between contractors and project monitors. Now, my colleague Matt will walk us through our problem deconstruction.
Thanks, Rodrigo. My name is Matt Weber. I'm going to begin by taking a step back. Rodrigo has described four main aspects of our conclusions. But before we got to the conclusion, we had to figure out what was going on at a greater level of detail. Just saying that there are a large number of abandoned projects in Nigeria, that it happens throughout the government, throughout the country, in every state, and has happened for a long time, does not clarify points of action which could move the needle on a solution, which could address key aspects of the problem. So in an attempt to break down this condition of abandoned projects in Nigeria, we started to name sub-problems, sub-issues. And in this Ishigawa diagram, this fish diagram you see here in front of you, we bucketed those points that we found through our exploration into 6 different categories. But initially, we would come up with a point like conflict of interest between the private and the public sector. And we would say, maybe that's really the problem. That's what has to be done. And then later we would say, maybe it's that newly elected people don't really gain by supporting initiatives for their political opposition who they have just replaced. Maybe that's really the key to this. And over time and repeated research and discussion and exploration, we were able to create these data points and then bucket them in these 6 categories. And I'll run through the 6 categories for you briefly. The first was budgeting. Now, Rodrigo mentioned budgeting considerations as one of our key takeaways. And the heart of that is that you can't fund new projects and also fund legacy projects without increasing your overall budget. As new administrations come in, they have new plans, and they'd be short of funds to execute their new plans if they just followed through on all the old plans, which their political rivals had put in place. It's a natural tension that as an elected official, you would like to see the actions which you were elected on be implemented and fairly represent the stakeholders who brought you to office. However, there is also the existing commitment of programs which might take 3, 4, 10 more years to complete and will require a significant amount of the state budget to do so. The next category, planning. It seemed as if there was low capacity for project planning. One key example of this would be Nigeria's inflation rate. Given the inflation rate of Nigeria and the amount of time it takes to implement a project, we noticed that the budgets were unrealistic. They didn't have any factor taking into account inflation. There were also local constituencies that seemed to not be consulted. This often led to projects being put in places that might not have chosen that particular project or wouldn't have chosen that expression, that solution to the problem that they were having. The third part that we noticed was accountability. There isn't a lot of anti-corruption enforcement, although there is a department designed to look into it. There is an inherent conflict of interest between the private sector, which seeks to make money off of contracts with the government, and the public sector, which seeks to provide a public good at an efficient cost. It seems as if in the present circumstance, very often the private sector wins in all cases, and the public sector frequently does not find an efficient means of creating public solutions. The incentives to increase accountability are low, and the transparency, which might allow citizens of Plateau State to come to an honest appraisal of the quality of the actions of their state government is very limited. So that's the accountability category. Election cycles seem to also be at issue. As we said earlier, newly elected people don't gain support by continuing to support initiatives of their political opposition who they've just ousted. The governmental structure is also at issue. There is not a lot of reward for supporting previous projects. There's limited citizen engagement and feedback. There's no punishments for not supporting previous projects. And then lastly, and this is somewhat of a more macro note, we focused on Plateau State, but the geography of Nigeria is highly varied and has very different geographic areas. In the south, there's dense jungle. In the northeast, there are insurgent groups, and there's the possibility of insecurity and of violence, which make public works projects hard to implement. So these were the types of problems that we came up with underneath this big heading of abandoned projects in Nigeria. And I've taken a little bit of time to explain them to you because they point to the larger process that we went through as a team to meet with our counterpart in the Plateau State government, and then to meet with people that he recommended we discuss with in NGOs, in other community organizations, throughout the government in other areas, people that might specialize in water projects, people that might specialize in electricity projects. Each one of these conversations, each one of these documents that we were able to uncover individually, we brought together as a team to discuss and then weigh and come up with the information in this diagram. So from that, we came up with, I guess, the next slide, Rodrigo. Entry points identified. So from this condition of a number of corruption of state projects being abandoned, state projects being abandoned, and these 6 different buckets in our Ishikawa diagram, we came up with 3 entry points. One is governmental budget processes. If we could engage the Nigerian civil society organizations to play a role in building communication and rapport between the legislative and executive branch regarding budget dialogue, then we might be able to create, to amend one aspect of the intergovernmental communication that's at odds here. And this entry point, one more level of detail, is that at present, the governor would put forward infrastructure projects with a budget, and then the state legislature would come back with an amount of budget awarded, which would be less than that total amount. So for example, if your project was for $10 million, you might only be awarded 6. That would be plenty to start, but it wouldn't be much enough to finish the project, let alone take into account inflation. So creating an enhanced dialogue between the executive and the legislative branch might partially amend that key issue. The second was government monitoring and evaluation. If we adopted a draft of the National Monitoring and Evaluation Policy at Plateau State level, we could create a transparent and comparable data source for project completion and suspension. And that would allow people to have a better sense of those projects that are successful and unsuccessful in a less politicized environment. Just to be able to say, this is working well, this isn't working well. And over time, that would have a positive impact on designing projects. It might also have an impact over time in regulating projects already awarded. Lastly, in civil society, our entry point was through an organization called Eyes and Ears, which is operating in the neighboring Kaduna state. And what it does is it helps elected officials in project monitoring and holding their state government to account. Individual citizens can drive by the site of a public works project and say, the crane isn't operating today, or nobody's poured any cement and there's no workers on site. That can become an important crowdsourced information to help people understand what is or is not happening on the ground so that action can be taken in a timely manner. So these are the entry points identified and some of the means through which we arrived at those entry points. I'd like to now turn over the presentation to Tendai, who has more to share with us.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo and Matt. I'm Tendai Mvuvu, and I'm going to continue from where Matt left off. So the identification of the entry points was very important in that it allowed us a starting point into identifying possible suggestions that could help mitigate the ongoing problem of project abandonment in Nigeria. This process was very iterative, and as we deliberated on the entry points and had constant feedback with our authorizer and some stakeholders that we spoke to, one key suggestion that surfaced was to produce a report that would provide an initial roadmap towards implementation of the identified recommendations. So we agreed that we could include three main things in the report. One of them included a framework for action that would promote outreach to Nigerian civil society organizations. And as Matt noted earlier, we saw that there was a vast opportunity in engaging civil society in fighting this ongoing challenge in the country at so many levels. And then we also felt that the current national monitoring and evaluation policy provided a good benchmark on tracking and assessing projects in Nigeria and could be modeled and adopted at local level in Plateau State. So coming up with, coming up with clear objectives and a key result table seemed to be like an initial step towards the right direction on how the team in Nigeria could implement their own Plateau State model that was going to be adopted from the national M&E policy, and that was going to be very context specific and meet the needs of the people in Plateau State. And lastly, we also the value of civic engagement at grassroots level, like Matt has indicated earlier, how grassroots level, and we had heard about the positive progress of the Eyes and Ears civic program in Kaduna State. And we thought we could come up with an outline of steps in maybe campaigning to adopt the same or similar program of Eyes and Ears program in Plateau State that would identify stakeholders and possible financial resources. However, it is important to note that these were our earlier thoughts and iterations, and eventually we did not write a report with all the factors that I've talked about, but this iterative process was very useful in developing ideas that we later recommended for the Plateau State government. I think this is a very crucial step in the process and should not be rushed or skipped, as it really sheds light on what is possible and impossible within different contexts and the resources that are available. We learned a lot from David when we're sort of ranking what's possible with him as a technical advisor in his absence. And later on, when we spoke to him, we realized that there were certain things that he could do and certain things that he could not do. So that was very important for us. And anyway, I'll discuss what we later came up with out of this process in the next slide. So the letter recommendations identified. As you can see, there's so many similarities with the entry points. And like I said, this was an iterative process, and PDIA is very focused and pushes towards iteration, deliberation, ongoing feedback. So we came up with 3 suggestions, which are very similar to what Matt spoke about engaging civil society organizations to build the bridge between the Plateau executive and legislative and budget discussions, because we felt that there's an opportunity in this space, especially when it comes to budgets. And we had one of our key stakeholders that we worked with. She was also very influential in that space when it comes to budgeting. And then we also saw a marked potential in adopting the national M&E policy, like I said. So recommendation 2 centered on the Plateau State government coming up with their own model and then piloting this draft of the Plateau National Monitoring and Evaluation Policy that was going to be context specific. And lastly, the implementation of the Eyes and Ears platform in Plateau State, mostly for accountability, like Matt has indicated earlier. And I think one of the key reasons why we're so interested and very fascinated by this civic engagement platform, we had heard how it had gained traction and was working, seemed to be working and yielding positive results in Kaduna State. So we felt like there was potential to also implement a similar program in Plateau State. And I will leave the next slides to Nathalie or Nat, if Nathalie cannot join. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tendai. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Tendai. Thank you everyone for your patience. So after we identified the what's in terms of entry points, we did an extensive exercise with David to understand the hows and the risks involved in each of those leads and how we could tackle them in advance in these like smaller and quick cycles. So we did a mirror board with him, and just by way of visual illustration, so for the first entry points that Tendai mentioned, which was engage the Nigerian civil society organizations to build the bridge between the Plateau State executive and legislative, we've tried to identify like after these purple what posted, the pink house, so how could that take shape and could like happen in different like forms. So that was like a very interesting like iterative exercise that we did with Dave and his team. So for instance, it could take the shape of a workshop with the Budget ID, which is a civil society organization in Nigeria. It could take shape in the form of identifying key community leaders. So we identified each of those house in the red post-its in the mirror board, and then we identified like risks, what could be like the main risks in each of those next steps and how to mitigate them. And then after that, Rodrigo, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, after doing this exercise, we had more clarity to design our short-term action learning agenda for the Plateau State. And that started, I mean, the steps that we put together, they were ambitious in a way that they represented like a progress forward in relation to where the problem of abandoned projects had been advanced so far, but they were also still feasible, like in a time frame as short as in the next 10 days after our final interaction. So for instance, referring to lead 3 that Tendai mentioned, we set up like a next step, which was as simple as contact the Eyes and Ears developers to calculate the cost of implementing the system that it did in other Nigerian states in the Plateau State. So to have a better view of how to tackle like the broader lead 3. And then we had a second next step related to lead 2, which was around which referred to organizing in the next 3 weeks an informal session with the state legislator to discuss the federal draft policy on the national monitoring and evaluation program, like, and how that could translate into the Plateau State voluntarily. And then we traced like this agenda that run like from 10 days after our last interaction until 1 month after that, like with feasible but it's still relevant steps that could move Dave's team like ahead in understanding and reflecting on the problem. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you, Rodrigo. As a sum up of all the lessons we learned so much. Maybe this was one of the hardest part, like to summarize the amount of like huge learning that we had here. But as Rodrigo mentioned, like very in the beginning, I think one of our first like learnings was to differentiate problems from conditions. And when doing like the PDIA process, really trying to frame what we had before our eyes as a problem that can be tackled, that can be deconstructed, that can be better understood, and that can be, advanced like through short cycles of conversations with other stakeholders, show like short ideas and a timeline that is feasible, that is real for the team, like on the ground. Because if we just get that as a condition and we feel like falling this trap, we feel like really disempowered to better understand and tackle the problem. We also learned, maybe like this is a more like clear learning from the process, we also learned like this framework to deconstruct the problem and to like depart from, a really hairy problem, to go like through their causes and to identify a change space inside that cause and connect to that. We learned like to look at causes not as obstacles to face the problem, but rather as the clues to map like possible learning space, learning opportunities, and a change space to tackle the problem. We learned that even for the causes that were really hard to be tackled, the simple fact of mapping them and recognizing them as a team helped us build authority over them and have this like sense of like empowerment to look at them as tackled issues. We also like learned like these practice of like quick practical learning opportunities on, we got better at finding these opportunities, and understanding that finding and tackle them is way more important than strategize for the ultimate solution. That always strategizing for the ultimate solution can be very paralyzing, while finding and get the work done on these like quick practical learning opportunities is the contrary of paralyzing. It kept us moving through the process. And last but definitely not least, we had a huge learning around the importance of teamwork and of building trust as a team. And maybe today was like a clear example of that. I was like almost unable to connect, was having like huge issues like to connect. But I really trust the team that like we would make it, and I'm glad we did that, and I'm sure we wouldn't like be where, I mean, as a team, like I wouldn't be as confident of that if we had not like built trust, not only through the intellectual work we put together on this, but also like the work of emotional collaboration with each other. We are, as a final word, so thankful like for being together and for having learned so much in the PDIA, and so thankful to Dave especially, and to the like dozens of Nigerian policymakers, people who are the real like leaders on the ground, moving forward on these like super complex issues around abandoned projects in Nigeria. We are like incredibly thankful for this opportunity, and we are very happy to get your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. I'd now like to invite Matt Andrews to share a few words about this program. Usually we do have our IPP alumni, and unfortunately David had an emergency meeting to actually talk about this policy that the students worked on, this monitoring and evaluation policy. So he unfortunately cannot make it with us today, but I would like to invite Matt Andrews to share a few words. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Salimah. This is a really, really important issue, and it's one that actually over the years, through the work at BSc, we've engaged with in different ways. We've had people at executive programs for a number of years come and say that there are all of these projects in Nigeria that are not being completed, sometimes not even being started, etc., etc. We've even worked with a team of Nigerians in the past. The observation that I have is that in many cases, when they have wanted to work with us, they have been working with international organizations who have told them what the solution was. And so, for instance, in the 1 year, we worked with a team and they'd been told, no, what you need to do is you need to have a better way of vetting projects. And so they worked on developing a tool to choose projects. And what was interesting is that a few years later, we worked with another team on exactly the same topic, but alongside other countries. And there was a team from South Africa that also had a problem with unfinished projects. And they said, well, what we need is we need a better tool to choose projects and vet them. And the Nigerians said, you can have our tool. Well, you know, we've developed this great tool, but we still have the problem. And I think that the interesting thing that the team did this year, using the PDIA, but also just with the patients of David and just their own patients, was instead of saying, here's what the solution is, and let's try and develop a solution, I think they spent time saying, let's really understand what's going on with this problem. And it's not that people haven't been trying things, but you're right, it's been a condition, meaning something that hasn't been working, but people haven't really been trying to solve. And one of the things that sometimes turns things into a condition is that people constantly jump towards ready-made solutions that actually don't work. And I think it's such a big danger, as demonstrated in this case, where you have had people working on it, but because they haven't been asking what's the problem, instead they've been saying, here's your solution, you end up not really getting to the problem. And I think what you guys have uncovered and really helped kind of David, I think, to lead to is that this is a problem that is as much about relationships and groups and pressure or the lack thereof from different groups as anything else. And, you know, to me, the major observation is just how many different parts of society are involved in this, and how many different parts of society are going to need to be involved in solving this. That this isn't just a lack of a good project selection mechanism. It's not just, well, we don't have a good way of kind of monitoring implementation. It has a lot to do with all of those things and the people who need to be involved. And I think you've done a really good job kind of showcasing that. The other thing that I think you did a really good job of was kind of really engaging people in the conversation who are not always engaged in the conversation. And for me, what was great about watching you guys work through the process was how every week you kind of learned something new, found a new person to talk to, from that person kind of built towards the next connection, the next connection, the next connection. And you know, often people say, well, this takes forever, you know, to really learn about a problem. It takes a long time. You guys started this in the last week of January. We worked until March with it. It was about 6 or 7 weeks. But, you know, even if it was from January till now, that would have been 6 months. It's not a long time. And one of the things that I do hope you take away is, you know, it is possible to do a good diagnostic job and to engage other people in the conversation in a relatively short amount of time. When people say it can't be done, I think that they just plain wrong, and they just haven't had the right system and mechanism to do it. What you need is a team of committed people, who you guys all are, and just a process of continual activity. So thank you guys for the work. It's really interesting. If David was here, thank you. You know, the topic is so important, so interesting. Obviously, there's a lot to work with now and to pick up on what you guys learned, and we'll see what happens in the days to come. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Salimah.
Thanks, Matt. I'd now like to open up to questions and answers, and I'll kick it off with the first question for our student team. And the question is, what surprised you in this process? And it can be something about the PDIA process. It could be a conversation. It could be your team. It could be, you know, anything in the process that surprised you.
I can start quick. I think everybody has things that were surprising about this process. I think to be told at the outset of a course that you don't know what a problem is a really strange thing to assert. But then to see it in action and to find a process that helps you to break it down into composite pieces, I think that was really very exciting. And to make our own group's process involve reading at least one article a week, talking to at least one person a week, then getting together as a team to meet and discuss. It created a very constructive and energized system for learning more about a problem, you know, even in the somewhat time-constrained you know, framework of a class. That's just one thing. I'll throw it open to the rest of the group for their thoughts.
I had one surprise as well. As we started looking at the problem specifically, maybe more on the core subject than in the process, to complement like what Matt just said. I was surprised to learn that we learned as a team that as widespread and as you know, relevant as this problem is in Nigeria, like it costs trillions of billions of dollars. I think if we put in dollars, there are some places in Nigeria who are doing better than others, and that could serve as inspiration, and that could serve as bright spots inside, you know, the larger problem of abandoned states. So looking at more towards the end of the process, after we had deconstructed the problem and we had gathered some ideas, it was surprising to me to also not to lose sight of these bright spots, not to just, you know, get, you know, completely absorbed by the complexities of the problem, but also looking at where possible solutions could emerge, possible ideas of smaller entry points could emerge, and take those learnings forward. I think that was a very important surprise for me, in this problem specifically.
For me, I don't think it was really a surprise, but I want to highlight it, was the importance of the collaboration with David, our counterpart in Nigeria, because we specifically in the early recommendations, we came up with some ideas that we later figured out that David had already tried, and that gave us a lot of insights as to what worked and what didn't, and allowed us to focus our efforts towards the entry points that had not yet been explored by him in the past. So I think that collaboration was really important to guide the process and to design the next iteration.
Yeah, I think for me, there were two main surprises, and one of them was when I heard that we're going to work on abandoned projects in Nigeria, and when I looked at the magnitude of the problem and the amount of money that has been wasted over time. And I mean, Nigeria is one of the largest countries in Africa in terms of landmass and population. How is this even going to be possible? How are we even going to deconstruct this problem? But when we started working together with my team and with all the stakeholders that we worked with and asking people from Nigeria about this problem, I was quite pleasantly surprised that no matter how big the adaptive challenge looks like or could look like, as long as you can just deconstruct the problem, coming up with bite-sized chunks, you can actually come up with not maybe solutions, but maybe suggestions. There's a starting point somewhere, especially the entry points. And it gave me so much hope that, you know what, no matter how huge the problem is, there's always like that potential. And most of the times, like coming from the field of global health that I work in, problem deconstruction is something that we normally don't do. So it's always looking at this giant problem and then we want to attack it. It's like trying to attack an elephant using a spear or something like that. So that was one major pleasant surprise for me. And then also when we were working with David and we were ranking who is authority to do what, who could, yeah, that whole process. You know, we had so many thoughts about him, like, okay, he can do A, B, C, D, he can move this piece, because we looked at the title that he held and thought that he could be, you know, like that panacea was that silver bullet to solving some of these problems. But then we realized that during that whole ranking system, it's not always like that. That's the, I guess it also falls under the whole problem deconstruction, when you are now looking at the recommendations and the suggestions, that it's very easy, especially when you're not on the field, to just look at Matt and say, oh, Matt as the director or as the technical advisor, he can pull up some strings. But then we realize that these are complex problems. They require a lot of networking and connections with certain departments, certain people. So the authority that you might actually place on a certain individual to do the work might be wrong, but it was just nice to learn about all those things. And, you know, that iteration and all that constant feedback just opened my eyes, and I'm really excited to hear where Plateau State is going to go with all these recommendations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to open the floor for any questions that you may have. If you can use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, if you have a question. You can also put it in the chat if you would like. Katya?
Thanks, Salimah, and thank you to the team for your presentation today. Really appreciated learning more about your work. I wanted to ask specifically about the leads board that your team came up with, because I was super intrigued by that process, and it seems like it's a really nice way to collect all of your thoughts and ideas before diving into a specific entry point. And so I'm curious about that process, kind of how you were able to navigate that with your authorizer, and maybe some tips for those of us who may want to use that on future projects. Thank you.
I can start, and anyone else, like, please join me and help. So because of the remote mode of work together with David, we are constantly you know, wondering how we could work together online on time. And then we obviously use like Zoom. We had weekly recurring meetings with him, but then we got to this point of the process that, as like Matt said, Rodrigo and Tendai as well, like we really needed like to be building iterations that were completely realistic for him, and that were not just a repetition of either, you know, solutions that he had tried in the past or that he knew could not work for some reason, for some good reason or other. So when we got like to this later stage, when we were like to derive an action learning agenda from the entry points, we decided to use this tool, which is called the Miro board, where we were like the 5 of us together, the 4 of us and David, in a, like, it was like a very like agile, like 1-hour meeting where we plotted ideas, and we had like these like short cycles of, oh, here are the 3 entry points. How can we implement them? And then we would like be like in breakout rooms with like the 2 of us together, and when we would be coming up, we will be deriving from the purple post-it, we will be deriving the hows in the how to make them like real action items in the pink post-its. And then once we had plotted there, we had like another 10-minute like quick, you know, iterative like group, like short group work on, okay, like, but what are the risks on that? What are the risks that especially like we are not seeing? because we are afar, because we don't have like the full context that David might have, and that might be there. But at the same time, what are the risks that we can see, because we have like maybe, more perspective, more an outside perspective from the problem that David might not have. And then we came up in this week cycle with the green post-its, and then finally we did like a final like cycle to think like together about how to mitigate each of them. So I don't know if this like perfectly responds to your question, but this was super helpful in the later stage of the process, when we really wanted to, to build an action learning agenda that was meaningful, that was feasible, that was also at the same time, bold enough, even if like, smaller steps. They were like smaller transformative steps.
On behalf of the rest of the group, I would say it was Nathalie who came up with the mural board, and we were all amazed. It was a great pleasure to use, and it was really energizing to all who were involved. Once they figured out how to use the board, it was something that each person could get into in their own laptop and move through together in a coordinated fashion. And to see everybody's ideas come together in visually through that board was it was a really enjoyable moment for the process. So Nathalie gets the praise for that.
Did anyone else want to add to that question, or you're all good? Okay, great. We can move on. We have two questions in the chat, one from Van and one from Yinka. Van, would you like to voice your question?
Hi, so I'm Van Dran. I'm the new research librarian and data librarian in the library. I just started May 18th, so this is a wonderful way for me to learn about what you're working on. It's thank you very much. It was very, very helpful for me. My question was one to do with context. The magnitude of the problem really surprised me. This is the first time I've heard of this. So I wanted to know whose money is being wasted.
Great, thank you. And Yinka, if you could also voice your question, and then the team can respond to both questions.
Yes, thank you. I wondered, I'm sorry I came in late, so I don't know if this was said in the beginning, but I was wondering whether in the course of your work, the Plateau State governor was involved in any way. Did he know about what was happening? And I was wondering how whether there's a way or a mechanism to feed in your recommendations into those at decision-making levels in the state.
Thank you very much, Yinka. Over to you, team.
I can tackle the second question by Yinka. The Plateau State governor was not involved directly, but he is working one-to-one with David Wuyep, who was our counterpart in Nigeria, and who is the technical chief and head of project management and results delivery office in the state. So we had direct contact with his office, which is in charge of solving this problem at the state level. And we don't have, obviously, a way to ensure that our recommendations are implemented, but we did make sure that what we came up with was responded to the technical and budget limitations that David had in his office. So we constantly worked with him, fine-tuning our recommendations to ensure that they were feasible and that they could be implemented in his office. And we actually asked the explicit question about the feasibility of our recommendations constantly to David. So I think that our chances of recommendations being implemented rest on that constant feedback we had with him.
Rodrigo, to piggyback on your answer, I feel like the way that you're asking the question implies that there would be some authority which would sanction our answers and then follow them forward. And that's a very common practice in development work, where you're looking for the highest level of authority to sanction your solution often a top-down solution or a ready-made solution, and then force it forward. I think not to be the expert on the PDIA method, but I feel like what we were doing in our short time period was to try to build up possible solutions from the ground up that would then recommend themselves, so that people who were able to make policy could conceive of what we had suggested and enact those things in a reasonable period of time, and feel confident that it would create progress in this broader issue. So that's not to say that it's not important that the governor wasn't directly involved, or that David Wuyep do his utmost to continue to carry these solutions forward, which I'm confident that he's doing. But just to kind of step back a second and say, what makes PDIA such an interesting solution is that you're building it up from the ground up, and that as you do so, you're developing a sense of authority as you explore these different avenues and creating a natural coalition, which will then also serve as advocates for these separate entry points. And I think that's a powerful aspect of this approach.
Yeah, I would just emphasize what Matt just said about the people, and you know, we build this kind of informal authority as much as we engage more people in the process. So even if we can't be 100% sure that this is going to be implemented, the likelihood of implementation is proportional to the number of people with whom we interact, that we bring together through the process. And I think this builds on legitimacy and likelihood of real implementation, I would say.
And any responses to Van's question on whose money is being wasted?
I can try to answer that. These are public projects. So the government, it's part of the government financing the whole portfolio from the government. So I want to believe it's also taxpayer money that is being wasted. It's also money that the government of Nigeria probably borrows from IMF, the World Bank. And I guess the important point is whether it's money that is donated, whether it's money that the government of Nigeria borrows or taxpayer money. I think the most important thing is that resources should not be wasted. Money, time, human resources, developing these projects that end up not being utilized or not being constructed to full effect. So I think for me, the more important thing is that the source of the money might not be primary, but just making sure that money is not wasted on something that can be, they can maybe put that money towards certain projects that are going to benefit the people of Nigeria.
Thank you. Jemima has a question from the chat, and she also talks about the Eyes and Ears project that you guys highlighted and is happy about that. Jemima, if you want to share.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry I can't come on video right now. This has been a very impressive presentation, to be honest. As I mentioned in the chat, I work with the Kaduna State government. I've been with them for 2-3 years now, and I know how much work the Eyes and Ears project have been able to kind of change the way we implement projects in Kaduna State. And I'm so glad that you would consider this for Plateau State. I also know that Kaduna State sort of sets the trend for many states in Nigeria, so I'm just impressed about that. My question really is about local government. I know you worked with someone in the Plateau State, the governor's office or so. I'm curious about how much involvement that the local governments get in the analysis, considering that if you want to get the projects to reach the last mile, is usually implemented by the local government, sort of like drainages and culverts and small rural roads and things like that. I wanted to know how much you involved local government or asked and how they're doing it and the processes they're using and how that impact can be changed from the grassroots moving up. Thank you.
That's a really great question. I think the short answer is we have much more to learn about how the local governments work. And that would be another line of questioning. It was our research at the time that the process of budgeting for projects came up from the local level to the state level, and then was turned into project proposals that ran through the governor's office or otherwise came to the legislature. So we didn't focus so much on how those initial projects came up and then flowed back down. We did speak with a number of different departments in the state government, which had to do with particularly water projects or particularly electricity projects. But we didn't have a chance to speak with representatives at the local level. At least I personally didn't. We reviewed some research that touched on it, but I think my first answer is the best, that we still have a lot to learn. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that one? Maybe I'm not fully in the know.
Yeah, I think David also really tried to connect us with a lot of people, but there were so many challenges. I mean, it's been a very interesting year with Zoom and internet, and as you can see, even David himself could not be here today because he had to be engaged in another meeting. So that was one of the main challenges that we also faced, where we could not talk to some of the key stakeholders, including people from the local government, because I remember he actually wanted me to speak with someone, but we kept on sending emails back and forth, and that conversation never really transpired. But I really get that point, Jemima, and I think it's very important, especially when we're targeting grassroots and local government. Their inclusion will be very crucial if this is going to be effective.
Also, I wanted to point out that, as Matt Andrews mentioned, we worked on this for around 6 or 7 weeks, so our timeline was limited. But actually, we, in our action learning agenda, we included specific points, action points for David and the Plateau State Office to contact local governments and governments in other states to work with them. So although our capability of contacting local governments directly was very limited due to time constraints, we did consider that in our action learning steps.
Yeah, maybe one final comment, like just to complement what like all my colleagues said, is that I think we came to understand also that the different levels of governments, they retrofit themselves. So for instance, one of our action items was voluntary implementation of a draft national policy on evaluation and monitoring of public projects. So it's almost like in the lines of our learnings that as much as local governments, they are a very important lab that we should definitely consider, like for future iterations of this problem. We believe that if the Plateau State sets certain policies, it can help, it can retrofit, like it can benefit from the local experiments, but it can also incentivize the best experiments under the state level to also develop and flourish. So I feel like this is something we definitely saw coming from the federal to the state, and that, I mean, it's my guess that can also work from the state to the local level and vice versa.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to stress again that this class, the objective of this class was not to solve these complex problems, because that is not what our objective was. It was to allow our students to be able to learn how to use the PDIA, problem-driven iterative adaptation process, and also to be able to help deconstruct this problem for their authorizer and to identify entry points. This year, we had to do this entirely remotely because of the pandemic. So the team has not even met each other, let alone, David, or been able to travel to places. And despite all of those constraints, in 7 weeks, they were still able to make a lot of progress. And, the citizen platform that they suggested is something that is currently being worked on. David emailed me while he could not make it. He did share that those are things that they are doing. And that draft policy is actually being spoken about today. It's the reason that he was not able to join us, that monitoring and evaluation policy. So all this to go and say that the work that our team did was very useful for the authorizer, and the authorizer really enjoyed engaging with 4 people who he said were very diverse and have not been to Nigeria and do not know how things work there, but their curiosity to want to learn, to ask questions really did help in this process. And for that, I want to thank David for working with our students and giving them a really great opportunity to learn how a process works through working on a problem, a real world problem where they could make some progress. And I would really like to thank our student team, Matt, Rodrigo, Tendai, and Nathalie, for taking a chance, for trusting us, and for all of the incredible work that they have done. And innovating, Nathalie, with your Leeds board, even at a time when we are all stuck in our houses and in our rooms trying to work on this stuff. So thank you very much for everything. And I wish you the best in your future endeavors. And I hope that you can take some of the things that you learned in this course to your future lives working in international development. Matt Andrews, did you want to say anything else?
No, just to echo what you say, Salimah, I think this is great work and I think it's a great topic. And it's just very exciting to see people who are willing to engage in, I guess, the uncertainty and the ambiguity of a really difficult topic, and to try new things. And I think that we need that more and more in development. And we need it in the face of problems that confound us and problems that we don't know how to deal with. So it's really encouraging to see. So thank you. Hope everyone is doing well.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this session. Our last event of this series will be held next Tuesday, June 15th at noon, and it will be on tackling radicalization in France. Thank you. We hope to see you then. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.